In this lesson, I'm going to demonstrate the concept of tuples in Python. In other words, how do we use them? What are they? What do they do for us? So while coding in Python, we either tend to use lists that we took a look at in previous lessons, and we also talked about the concept of dictionaries. But here, I'm going to describe, explain, and then demonstrate the concept of tuples. So what is a tuple in Python? A tuple is simply a sequence of immutable Python objects. Tuples are sequences very similar to lists. In fact, they are exactly like lists. The only difference between tuples and lists are that tuples cannot be changed, unlike lists. And tuples use parentheses, whereas lists use square brackets. So just a minor difference between a list and a tuple. The function, however, is the same. Here's the tuple syntax. They may be constructed in a number of ways. For instance, we can use a pair of parentheses to denote an empty tuple. We can use a trailing comma for a singleton tuple, such as a comma or parentheses a comma. We can also separate items with commas. And it's important to note that it is actually the comma which makes a tuple, not the parentheses. Here's a small example of a tuple. So let me in fact demonstrate this. So I'm going to click on our Python shell here. I'm going to open up our editor by clicking on File, New File. And let me resize so we can in fact see. All right, great. So here's how we're going to create our first simple tuple. Again, recall it's just a list, right? The only difference is you can't change a tuple once you create it. So let me begin. Let's do a comment here. This is our first tuple. And all we do is we define a variable here, simple assignment statement. And we're going to use, let's say, some subjects here like physics. Just building a list here. Chemistry, biology, and we can combine some numbers as well. Let me create another one, which is tup2, and this equals just a set of numbers, 4, 5, and 7. Okay, great. And then I'm going to tell Python to print the output. And I'm going to say something like this prints tup0, and then I'm going to put a comma and then actually do the tup1 and then end this. Make sure our convention stays the same. All right, great. So here's our first print statement. Let me in fact create another one. So I'm going to say something like print, and this prints, and I'm going to use my second tuple here, tup2, and here I'm going to give it a range. You can always, and we've done this before, so in a previous lesson we took a look at how to print very similar to lists. Okay, and of course our tup2 here for the output, and the output is range 1 through 5. Close my brackets and close the parentheses. All right, great. So just a simple tuple. Let's see what happens when we run this tuple. So let's click on run module. Of course, Python always asks you to save the module before you run. So click OK. And this brings up my Windows Explorer. I'm going to navigate to my documents folder, my data files, and Python folder. This is where we've been saving all the modules. So we're going to call it tuple. Click save. And Python gives you the output. So this prints tup0, which is physics. And the second tuple prints 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, depending on your requirement or your specified as per your own code. So just a simple tuple that we created, right? And you can build upon this as per your own requirement. Now, what happens, for instance, if we need to update a tuple, right? Now recall, tuples are immutable, right? Which means you cannot update. But let's see what happens. So first, let me in fact write this so that you would know. So tuples are immutable, which means you cannot update or change the values of tuple elements. Okay. However, what we can do here is that you can change, let's see, the values within the tuple. So you can change the values here of tuple elements. Okay, so we can't update the tuple, but we can always change the values of the tuple elements to create a new tuple. Okay, so this is how you would essentially create. So let me in fact hit the enter key so we can see it on the same editor here. And recall, we're using the 3 quotes, which means that we can always add multiple lines, and this is what that means. Okay, so I'm gonna close this, and let me increase the size of our editor here. Great. Okay, so tuples are immutable, which means you cannot change or update the values, but what we can do is we can always create a new tuple. So let's say we created this first tuple up here, which has physics, chemistry, biology, list of courses, and the second tuple had some integers or numbers. Let's see what happens when we create another tuple here. So let's say it's tup1 equals, all right, let's just write some numbers here. Say 12, I don't know, 34, or we can do a float number, 34.56. And then let's do another tuple, tup2 equals, and here we can use some strings like ABC and XYZ. Close the parentheses. Okay, perfect. Now, the following action is not valid for tuples. For instance, if I were to do something like tup10 equals 100, well, Python is not going to allow me to do so, right? So I need to make sure that I use the correct syntax. So let's see what happens when I run this. Click on run module, click OK to save, and Python executes and provides me the output. So here, for instance, notice at this point it's only printing the tup0 and tup2, which is similar to the first results. Nothing is happening or has happened to our tup1 here, right? Because we haven't specified the print statement for this particular addition in this instance. So let me in fact get rid of the first one. Okay, and just use our simple comment and our multiple line comments here. And here's an example of tup1 and tup2. Okay, so let's say, for example, if I need to say something like, I'm going to write this down so we know as a comment. So following action is not valid for tuples. And which action is this? So I'm going to write it down so we can see. For example, tup1, and then if I were to say 0 in brackets equals 100. Okay. And what we can do here, so I'm going to say, so let's create a new tuple as follows. So here, since tup10 equals 100 is not a valid action, to overcome this issue, we can create a new tuple. So how about say something like tup3, right? That'd be a new one. And simply do a tup1 and use our concatenation, add tup2. And of course, I need to give my print so that it prints the output. And I'm going to say print the tup3 variable. Great. Let's see. Run this. Click on Run Module. Click OK to save. And Python now provides me the output. So it says 12, 3.56, and then adds the other tuple to it, ABC, XYZ. So here, again, we cannot really change the tuple, but what we can do is we can add a new tuple to existing tuples. So this is how you would go about making additions to your tuple, which is, again, it's a list. Minimize this. Okay, so why do we use tuples? Tuples are faster than lists. So for instance, if you're defining a constant set of values and you're ever going to do this, it is iterate through it, for example, use a tuple instead of a list, right? So it makes your code safer if you write protect data. That does not need to be changed because tuples are immutable, and it also protects your code. Tuples can be used as keys in a dictionary, but lists cannot be used this way, since dictionary keys must be immutable. So, a few advantages of using tuples as opposed to using lists. And here are some basic tuple operations. I demonstrated the concatenation, for instance. We can add two tuples together and obtain the output. But what I want to show you here before I end this lesson is how do you delete a tuple, right? So if you have this tuple created, how we delete it. So let me bring our editor back up. So here's tuple 3, right? It's tup3 that we created that added tup1 and tup2. So to delete a tuple, write a comment. This is how you would delete a tuple. In fact, it's pretty straightforward. So you would use del function for delete and simply say tup3. Okay, that's really that simple. And let's run the module. Click on Run Module. Click OK to save. And now tup3 has been deleted. But how do we know? Well, going to my shell prompt here, if I say tup3, it's going to give me an error saying tup3 is not defined. Whereas if I did not have this delete code within my module, let me delete this, run the module again just so that you can see. Click OK to save. So here's our results. Now if I were to type tup3, I'm going to get my output in Python. Okay, so deleting is fairly straightforward. The function is del and then your variable that you wish to delete. Okay, so practice using tuples. Remember the differences between list and tuple, and of course the advantages of tuples as they're a powerful element in Python. So practice, and let's move to our next lesson.